Hi everyone, welcome to FY028 Inquiry-Based Learning. This is week 8, and this week we're going to have a look at how to improve your research report. At this stage in the module, I'd imagine it's the case that you've selected your idea and you've been finding sources related to that idea, that research question, from databases and other online sources. And you're reading them through and you're taking notes and you're beginning to think about how to fit all of these pieces of information together in order to construct this research report that you're aiming to submit at the end of the module. And therefore, we thought it'd be a good idea to recap over the fundamentals of writing a research report, but also dig a bit deeper as well and explore some of the nuances and finer details regarding the reporting of research and what readers are looking for and what they're going to expect to see. And you're thinking about your academic voice, how you word things and how you flow between sections of the report. All with the intention of enabling you to communicate your research with more impact and engage the reader as they read it. Okay, so we're going to start by having a look at these essential points written here. And the first bullet point we see here is the idea of writing a research report to tell a story. Not a fictional story with made-up characters and a storyline, but instead constructing an argument over the entirety of your report. And you may start with context and background and articulating the research problem, the research question, why this research is important, and then taking the reader on a journey through the key arguments and key ideas for and against this particular research problem that you're investigating, and then concluding at the end either with a summary of the result, whether you've actually answered the research question or not, or setting out recommendations based upon that. Okay, so that's the kind of the essence of this report, and whatever word length that is, whether that's 2,000 words for this report, whether that's 10,000 words for your undergraduate dissertation, or whether that's 100,000 words for a PhD or a book, the emphasis is the same. It's really just taking the reader on this journey where each section builds upon the previous to construct this argument or this position that you're taking upon your research inquiry. So therefore, it's worth having that idea in mind as you come to write your research. It's always good to be reading over your work and reviewing it, but as you do so, think, where am I taking my reader? Am I taking them on a path? Are they getting a sense that I'm going in a direction here, or am I just walking all over the place, walking in circles, etc.? The idea is I want to take them from point A to point B, and I want to construct that bridge or that road that's as seamless as possible. I want my report to flow effortlessly from this position to this position, from my starting place to my destination. So what are those key areas? Where am I starting? What's my research question? Have I articulated that well? And what's the destination? What's the result? What's the outcome of this research process? Okay. And this leads us into our next point, which is we've not only got to persuade our reader to stay engaged with our report, and hopefully we can do this if we've written it well and we've written a report that flows and builds on each section, but we've also got to persuade the reader that this research is required for the research topic. And this is an interesting point because it all has to do with the activeness of researchers and people who read research. And we've already mentioned about active learning and active reading in a previous presentation, but you'll find that as you are reading other people's research and writing down questions and writing down comments and taking notes, other people are going to do that for your research, of course. So bear that in mind as you're writing your work, and be thinking about the types of questions that researchers and readers are going to ask. Or in this case, as it's an assignment, your tutors and your supervisors will be asking as they read through. And I guess the best research can kind of react to those anticipated questions before they're asked, if that makes sense. So they can kind of get a feel for the types of questions that readers and researchers will be asking if, say, the methodology hasn't been thought through very well, or if there have been problems or limitations. They want to try and find a way to mitigate against that. Again, it's all about the authenticity of the research and actually being open and being honest and stating that if there are problems and not hiding them, not trying to pretend that this research is not vulnerable to issues, or can it really provide the evidence to support the claims that it's making. And so if we're trying to persuade the reader that this research is necessary, then really we want to write it in a way that will prevent the reader from thinking it's unnecessary. And unfortunately, if it's not written very well and they're not getting a sense of direction, if they're confused, if they don't know where you're heading, if they get a feeling that actually you're just regurgitating other people's work and you're not really contributing anything of originality or anything that's valuable, they're probably going to think that this research isn't really worth reading. Okay, so it's best if you can mitigate that early, and you can be drafting and rewording and rephrasing and reordering your sections so that it flows and so that actually it does contribute something that's valuable, and actually it does offer something that is unique, and it does offer something that is worth the time taken to actually read it. Because of course you only get a short amount of time to impress or to engage the reader, and unfortunately if the opening parts of the research are not written very well, unfortunately that's not going to give the reader much confidence that the rest of the report is written well. So it's crucial that we make sure that the report is being strengthened and we try and avoid those areas of weakness, particularly at the beginning but also all the way through the report. Okay, to make sure the reader stays engaged and gets the feeling that this research is worth their time and it's worth reading and it's actually contributing something of value. Okay? And if we move on to the third point, we're actually going to build upon these themes here of active reading and not just regurgitating other people's work. So it's not a problem to summarize key ideas of other authors' texts or other researchers' work, but we do expect to see purpose and a reason why that's been included in your report. Not just for you to summarize other people's work, but then to go on and build on it and to contrast it with other authors' work and to discuss it and to comment on it and to raise questions of its credibility and how useful it is, and maybe the circumstances under which that research was conducted, or something that caused you to doubt the reason why they came to the conclusions that they came to. Maybe it was the place they actually conducted the research. Maybe it was the participants that they conducted the research with, or maybe it was the analysis tools they used, or the data collection tools they used, or some other factor that would cause you to doubt. And this, in essence, is what it means to be a critical researcher, someone who analyzes things in detail and actually is concerned with the small nuances and the methodology and the aspects and the conditions under which the research was conducted, not just someone who blindly accepts everything that's written down. Okay, and hopefully in an internet generation, you're old enough and wise enough to not just believe everything you read on the internet. The same applies with research. And it's not the case that we don't trust academics, but it's the case that actually they might have missed something when conducting their research. Or perhaps you've seen other research conducted under the same conditions, but have come to a different result or a different conclusion. And then that might cause you to raise questions of other pieces of research which come to different conclusions. And again, it's not to discredit other researchers, but it's to raise the question of what's really going on here and how do we get to the truth. If we're getting differing opinions and differing views, something must have happened. And what is that? Okay, that's what we mean by criticality. And actually, the best research will actually be drawing from these authors at the right time to actually strengthen the narrative and strengthen the argument that they're building. It's not just included just to fill up the word count. It's included because it has a clear purpose in constructing and developing this argument. It's actually part of the entire thread that you're building, and actually you're weaving it into this narrative that you're constructing. And this prepares us quite nicely for the final point here, the fourth point, which is all about the term of synthesis. And if you have any knowledge of music or you listen to electronic music, you'll know that synthesizers actually combine signals to create a much bigger sound. So this idea of synthesis is the same with writing, where we actually combine a mixture of material, a mixture of different sources, different ideas from different sources to create something new or to extend those ideas, to actually create new ideas based upon the unique combination of sources and our own judgments and our own, and perhaps in other modules, and eventually as you progress in the course, you'll get to do your own original research as well, okay, to actually create something that's actually greater than the individual components themselves. And so in summary, it's a combination of these themes of being purposeful with what we include, being active, anticipating what an author or a reader may be thinking as they're reading through the research, taking our readers on a journey, taking them from one point to another, and constructing this consistent and developmental story or narrative, if you like, an argument, an idea that is reinforced consistently through all of the sources and all of the sections that you include in your report. Okay, so let's move on now and have a look at the next slide, which further emphasizes that a research report shouldn't be a descriptive list of sources or summaries of those sources, and likewise it shouldn't be emphasizing and written around the sources that are described in the most detail. So hopefully we've emphasized this point enough to say that it's good to be summarizing other authors' work, but it has to have context and it has to have purpose, okay? It's got to mean something in the context of what your idea or what the overall aim is of your report. There's no point including a summary of something which isn't related or isn't building upon previous sections or is taking the reader in a completely different direction, okay? Because you want to try and scaffold things to build a path towards your destination. Remember, whatever your conclusion is. So all of the work that you refer to ultimately has to be pointing in that direction, or at least your discussion of that work has to be pointing towards the direction of your conclusion. So contextualization is key here, okay? And that's the third point. And that if you refer to someone else's work, it has to be related to your aim. And ultimately has to be qualified. It has to have a reason for being there. Sometimes that may be self-explanatory, but other times if it's not, that's where your active role as a writer and as a researcher comes in, because that's where you have to link up that particular quote or that reference to an author's idea and provide some explanation and provide a way of linking that to another point, perhaps one of your own points, or perhaps another source with another idea that then either relates to the previous or related to another point which extends it further or perhaps contests the original point. Okay, so that's part of your role there, is to help link those different sources together to construct this narrative, this story, this argument that develops throughout the journey of your report. And of course, we will go on to have a look at those main sections of the report and provide some hints and tips and practical points to get you started with that. But just before we do, I want to do a little bit more preparation before that, as I think it will be helpful and hopefully make the writing process a little bit more smoother and enabling consistency and development of ideas as you go from section to section. And the first thing I want to talk about here is the formulation and almost planning stage. Now, hopefully that you're getting close to the end of your research where you've collected the sources and you've identified the most relevant ones and you're reading them through and making notes and processing them, and perhaps you've finished that stage, or perhaps you're still in the process of doing that. But regardless of where you are within that stage, it's good to be thinking ahead, and perhaps if you implement the points here, that'll help the rest of this stage go well and also prepare you for the next stage, the actual writing up of that. So let's have a look at some of the points here. And now that you're reaching the end of your reading stage and your note-taking stage, where you've actually condensed all of these relevant sources that you've identified into a series of short notes or questions or comments, it's then a case of actually going through those notes and drawing out the most relevant information from that, which might then be useful to include in your research report. Okay, so here it's important to find the materials relevant to the topic explored and determine which sources make a significant contribution to the understanding of that topic. You'll probably find that there are a couple of sources within the ones that you've read through and taken notes on that actually stand out and are of more importance than, say, others that you've read through. Okay, so as you've been through one round of selecting the relevant sources from all of the other sources out there, you've then got to repeat that again for this small selection of sources that you've read. Out of that and all the notes that you've taken, you want to then again select the most relevant information from that, which is important to your research and your specific aim and objective for this research report. Because of course this is the essence of research, of starting with a broad selection of ideas and then allowing your focus to become refined and therefore getting narrower and narrower in your focus to enable you to ultimately answer your research question. And so a practical way to do this is to look at the findings and conclusions of all of the sources that you've read and all the notes that you've taken. Hopefully you've taken notes on the findings and the conclusions of these different sources that you've read. And by doing so, by having that condensed onto either a single piece of paper or perhaps on a few pages in a Word document, this will easily allow you to assess the relationships between these sources, whether there's a theme emerging from them or whether one source in particular stands out and that answers or at least responds to your research question. Okay, so by having these sources condensed into a smaller form, the essential details basically, this will easily allow you to compare and evaluate them and see the relationships between them. So recommend doing that, and that will also allow you to then consider whether they are to be included in your research report and whereabouts they go within that research report, what sections you're going to put them in, and at what stage you're going to use that information to build your argument. I've already mentioned about critical writing in this presentation, perhaps too prematurely if it was supposed to be covered later, but nevertheless, I can't overstate its importance. So I'll just remind you of the key ideas here, in that, of course, it's being concerned with the smaller details that may cause you to doubt confidence in the conclusions or the process by which those conclusions were reached from other authors, or perhaps even your own research. That's, I guess, the marker of integrity, being honest and stating if you recognize any limitations in your own research process, whether that's original research or analysis of other people's research, that may affect the conclusion that you come to. Okay, it's always a good idea to be open and be honest and admit those limitations. And unfortunately, the expectation to produce a certain result can sadly cause some researchers to compromise on their integrity by reporting things that they know are not true, or embellishing certain results or outcomes just to satisfy demands of employers or clients or whoever's funding the research. So unfortunately, there are human conditions there that affect the reporting of research. But here, as the stakes are not quite so high in this assignment, hopefully you can feel not so under pressure to report any limitations or any problems that are affecting your judgment or your conclusions that you've reached. The way that you can do this is by clearly presenting your own evidence and argument, which will lead to the conclusion. Like we said, if you construct this narrative that constantly builds towards your conclusion, then that's going to reduce the amount of holes, let's say, in your plot. It's going to make it harder for people to challenge your assumptions, or at least it's going to reduce the amount of confusion for them wondering how you got to that conclusion based upon the evidence that's reported. Okay, so this is why it's important to be transparent and basically lay out all of the thinking that you've gone through, of course written up in a good standard, of course, but if that comes through your report, then it's going to make it much harder for the readers to challenge that. Okay, so building upon the previous slide, in your preparation for the writing stage and constructing the report, as you analyse and look through the summaries and the notes that you've taken of all the different sources, as you come to think about your conclusions, make sure that you're selecting the appropriate sources to include within your report that can actually back up your conclusions. Okay, that's going to be really important for providing that evidence of those conclusions. Okay, so that the reader can see a clear link between the evidence reported and the conclusions that have been reached, or the findings of the report. Okay, so let's move on to the final slide of preparation, just before we have a look at the different sections of writing the report. And this is an interesting slide because this has a series of different contrasts here. And this is all to do with framing your academic voice. And here, what we're trying to encourage is a middle ground between two extreme positions. You'll see in the first bullet point that cynicism is at one extreme, and I suppose at the other extreme is naivety, simply naively believing everything you read on the internet. We don't want to encourage that, and likewise we don't want to encourage a sense of cynicism or mistrust in what we read and what we see, but instead a middle ground between them might be a healthy skepticism, i.e. just checking to see whether the evidence trail backs up the conclusions and what is reported. Basically what I've been trying to emphasize throughout the past few slides. Okay, that's why the evidence trail is so crucial. Okay, to link and provide the underpinning for the conclusions and the findings. Okay. And the next point here is that we don't want to promote cockiness or arrogance or being too full of ourselves and too full of our abilities and our promoting ourselves too much because, of course, we're not perfect and we don't do a perfect piece of research and we certainly don't know the full story. But likewise, we don't want to appear that we we don't know anything and we are incompetent or we're uncertain or we haven't really done a good piece of work. We want to be in a kind of a middle ground between the two where we have a sense of confidence in what we have done. Okay, we don't know the full story, but we have done a good piece of work here, and based upon that, we can reach certain judgments based upon what we have read. Let's move on to the third point. Judgment which is critical, yeah, but not dismissive. Okay, so obviously we don't want to disregard authors simply because they might have done something differently to what we expect, or perhaps we might detect that they've made a mistake in one of their decisions, or they've come to the wrong conclusions. We don't want to disregard that, but instead assess fairly as what parts of that report or that piece of work can we take and what parts can't we take. Okay, this is again the critique, the assessment of the small details, because of course there is no perfect piece of work out there. We're all humans, we're all infallible, we all make mistakes, we never conduct things perfectly, so every piece of work is vulnerable to mistakes. So be critical, but not negative or dismissive or disregarding things simply because they don't measure up to the standard of perfection. Fourth point, opinions without being opinionated. Okay, so this I think comes down to how we sound, how we come across in our report. And obviously, just to remind you, make sure that you write your report in third person to try and remove the appearance that you are influencing the evidence that's being reported. We want to make the evidence speak for itself, okay? But that's not to say that you can't actually express some kind of opinion or trend or judgment of what you've read through the report. It's actually just wording it in a way so that it's balanced. The idea here is that we want to try and remove personal prejudices or personal tendencies towards a particular viewpoint from a report. Okay, the idea, of course, is to be objective and to give the appearance of a well thought through and well considered piece of narrative here. And this is a further call to be writing down the references for your particular statistics or a viewpoint that you're expressing. You know, it wouldn't be appropriate just to say most of the world use this operating system or Agile is the most popular approach in industry without stating any evidence for these claims. Okay, that's kind of what we're getting at here, because without any evidence to back that up, we don't know whether that's just your opinion because you use that particular operating system or use the Agile methodology. It may not reflect the rest of the world. Of course, we don't know what the rest of the world is doing unless we actually do research into that and we collect data and we analyze it, and other authors have done that. So make sure if you're going to be making claims like that, make sure that you have some facts to back it up. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at the next point, which is careful evaluation of published work, not serial shooting random targets. I think this has to do with the quality of sources. So again, it's not so much about the quantity of sources that you have and just randomly picking the first article that comes up on a Google search, but be intentional about what sources that you're reading and pay attention to who wrote it and whether it's been reviewed and do they actually have any evidence for the claims they're making. If it's someone on social media or if it's a blogger, do they actually have any evidence for what they're saying? Can they point you to any research that they've done to actually back up their claims? Okay, so this is particularly why we recommend reviewing the academic sources out there, things that have been sources, texts that have been peer reviewed before they've been published, not just people posting stuff on social media and on forums which hasn't been reviewed. And I think we've already covered the next 2 points, but just to summarize them, fifth point is, of course, being fair and assessing fairly the strengths and weaknesses of other people's writing without prejudice, so not being opinionated, and likewise not being dismissive of mistakes, judging fairly, analysing it for its strengths and for its weaknesses, picking out the good parts, but also critiquing the bad parts about it, or at least the parts that we think would weaken the confidence in the conclusions or the findings that they are reporting. Okay, and then of course this builds into the final point as well, about making judgments on the basis of considerable thought and evidence, okay, as opposed to making judgments without reason. Again, it's all about having a well thought through process, finding a balance between opinions and critical thinking. Okay, so hopefully all these examples help to emphasize the importance of having a balanced view of all of these different aspects as you come to read and process your sources, and then also as you then come to in turn write your report, because again we want that balance to come out as you write your report. Okay, so hopefully that's enough preparation now. Let's start looking at the different sections of the report and how we can go about making a start with writing it. And of course, there are different ways that you can organize your report. You may wish to do that by subject. In some cases, there are more than one subject being covered in the report. Obviously, in our case, it's only going to be one of the 10 fields of computing that you've selected, and you've obviously selected a theme inside of that, a research question. So that's obviously going to be your focus for this report, but to say more generally, reports could cover more subjects, perhaps within a topic area. Perhaps you're investigating different aspects of a field or of a subject, and you may wish to organize your report, especially for larger reports, into different chapters. Obviously, each chapter can then address each subject in turn, as particularly the case in books, obviously. But other ways, of course, are chronologically. If it's a historical piece, it makes sense to write it in date order. Or perhaps if you're conducting your own research and conducting your own studies, and the reporting of that is going to be important for the building of the argument towards the conclusions, that makes sense to report that in order. And likewise, the third point here, if you're conducting a large piece of research and you have multiple themes and ideas running throughout that research report, then it makes sense to organize them into groups. So this is very typical for undergraduate dissertations or a master's or PhD level, where you have a larger literature review and you organize it in subheadings. And those are organized by the theme or the idea or a particular theory, which is discussed in turn and contrasted with previous sections. So regardless, whichever format of organizing your ideas you choose, it's still important to think about the relationships between the elements, okay? And that's important that those must be clear throughout the report, okay? So let's go on and have a look at where we might start the report, which obviously would be a good idea to start with an introduction. And even though introductions might be the first logical place to start when writing, obviously you've got a blank page in front of you, that's typically the place where you might start writing in order, but interestingly, academics usually advocate writing the introduction last, i.e. at the end of the report, once you've actually written down the discussion and the detailed parts of the body of the report and the conclusions. The introduction can then be written after that and make sure that it actually links to the main part of the report. So if you find yourself struggling to start with the introduction, maybe it's a good idea to talk about the detail and start by writing the main part of the report first, which we're going to come on to in the next slide. However, If you do want to start with the introduction, that's not a problem. You can always go back and revise it as well, so there's plenty of chances to draft it again. But to get you started, here we've got some typical ideas to what you might express in your introduction. Okay, and here we see that an introduction could define or explain the topic area which is to be addressed, and it's very common to see definitions being expressed of keywords within, particularly within qualitative research, where it's important that the readers know from what place the author is interpreting these words and basing their meaning around. So defining and explaining the topic area can help to alleviate any confusion for readers. You might find that's useful to do. Also, you can start by explaining the background and the main conflicts or agreements in the sources that you've looked at. Perhaps there's a common thread that's been identified amongst all of them. That would be a good place to start at. Perhaps that outlines your research area if they've all identified the same problem, perhaps, that needs to be explored further, and then you can detail the main aspects of that problem and the statistics behind that. Also, the third point, you may also want to start with the time frame that you're going to review. So if you're aiming to review sources between a particular time period, say 1991 and 2009, if that's going to be important to your research topic, your research question, then it's important to detail that up front so the reader knows. Likewise, you may want to also offer a rationale for your choice of source material. So again, if this is going to be important, i.e. the methodology behind the selection of source material, perhaps you had a very particular reason for selecting some texts and not selecting others, it would be a good place to specify that early on within the report. So that's a good thing to be mentioning if you're going to do that. And of course, you may wish to use some of these points or indeed all of them if you have enough word space. But perhaps for this particular report of your assignment at foundational level, as it's only 2,000 words, the introduction doesn't actually have to be that long. And again, you'd be amazed how quickly that can fill up. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some ideas of how to start your introduction. Obviously, it will vary from subject to subject and topic to topic as to the contents of the introduction and how you're going to go about introducing your topic area. But I mean, don't feel too much pressure to get it right first time, and don't get paralyzed by the amount of options you have of places you can start. If you're struggling to know how to begin, just start by writing some thoughts down and writing some key statistics down and ways of explaining your topic area. And then from there, you can actually just reword and rephrase and move things around, which is basically the process of drafting in order to progress towards a well-written introduction. Okay, so don't feel any pressure to get it right and get it perfect the first time you write it. That's probably not going to happen, but just make a start and then you can improve later. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some ideas for the introduction. Let's move on and have a look at the main body of the report. So if you've written something down for the introduction, or perhaps you're going to come back to it later, perhaps you're going to start with the main body of the report. Obviously, remember this is going to be the largest section of the report. If your introduction is only going to be a few hundred words and your conclusion is only going to be a few hundred words, then the remainder of that will be spent on the main body of the report, where you're going to be discussing and arguing and setting out the main ideas and the evidence which supports either the answer for the research question or at least attempts to discuss it in some way. Okay, so it's important that we get this part right, as this is where the main content is going to be discussed and argued and solidified. Really, it's the evidence that we were talking about earlier, which is going to be useful for informing the conclusions or the outcomes of the report. which is expressed later in the conclusion. So here, what you might find useful is to use subheadings to divide up this main discussion that you're going to have, or this argument of different opposing ideas, whatever your topic area is. Okay, because of course in a report you can use headings, so it's easy to organize things in terms of theme or topic. Makes it easier for the reader to know where they are in navigating the report, whereas obviously this is different from an essay, which is just one free-flowing piece of text, piece of prose. So a report's nice and logically ordered, which is helpful for the reader to understand where they are in the flow of the report. So, use this to advantage, create appropriate subheadings that lend themselves to groups or themes or topics that you're going to be setting out. And then, of course, that should make it easier for you then to break down this large part of the report into smaller sections, which hopefully should make it easier to write and help you to stay on track with discussing what you need to discuss and setting out the evidence that you need to set out. Okay, but of course, building into the next point, remember that you need to show the relationships between sources. Remember the points that we've been saying earlier. Don't just summarize all everybody else's work. Don't use up these precious words to just regurgitate what other people are saying. Use this to carefully craft your argument or your discussion, or actually showcase the evidence that builds and develops as you progress throughout these sections and these subheadings. Okay, so by all means summarize other people's work, but you've got to also play an active part in linking it to go somewhere. We want to head in the direction, remember. It's not just an unordered list of other people's work. And again, the third point here, remember to discuss the significant contributions. So obviously, if you're summarizing other people's work, it's going to be useful to point to the things that are actually relevant to your research question, and this is typically going to be the main contributions of this source. Unless it's another aspect that you're commenting on, it's usually going to be the contributions, the work, the actual findings of this source, whatever that might be. Okay, so this would be a good thing to concentrate on. And likewise, the final and fourth point is not to include ideas that are going to distract sources that are not relevant to the research question. I think hopefully this point is fairly self-explanatory, that we want to use these words wisely, and therefore we need to be specific and tightly scoped to only discussing things of relevance. Okay, hopefully that's self-explanatory there. All right, so hopefully that gives you some ideas to get started with this body of the report. And hopefully this should be made easier if you've been through the preparation stages. So I advise you to go back to those preparation stages if you do struggle with writing this main section of the report. And hopefully that will make things a little bit easier as you then come back to write them. And again, of course, you're not going to write it perfectly first time, but put some thoughts down, sketch out a plan for where you're going and what the main points need to be, and you can always develop it later. Okay, it's this constant redrafting process. All right, so once you've got an idea for that and you've got some things in place, then let's go on and have a look at the conclusion section in the next slide. And then finally, we have the conclusion section, which is understandably one of the harder sections to write, as it's such a key summary of all of the work that we've done, and summarizes the main points and then the outcome of the research. Okay, so it's tempting to think of the conclusion as an afterthought, as just something that we need to do, but it's essential that we write this conclusion effectively, because academics do actually tend to look at the conclusion first when they approach a source, typically because they want to know what the researcher has actually found. It's typical that they will look at the abstract and the introduction and then jump straight down to the conclusion to see what the result is and what the further work is. Okay, so it's important particularly in the academic sphere, that we get used to writing concise and effective conclusions. So bear that in mind as you come to write yours. Imagine that your tutors, in this case myself and Justin, are going to jump down to your conclusion before we read the rest of the report. What's the main thing or main things that you'd want us to know? Basically, how can you summarize all that you've done into a few hundred words and communicate it really effectively? Okay, if you can do that, that's a good conclusion. All right, so a good place to start, of course, is to draw out the main themes that you've identified from your main body of the report. And hopefully this is coming through. Hopefully you've been getting a feel for this as you've done the preparation by reading through the sources, identifying the links between them, the places where they're similar, the places where they're different. And that's beginning to form at that stage. But then as you actually write it up in your own words in the main body of the report, that should solidify those connections and really make that clear for you. Okay, so that's what we want you to bring out in your conclusion. So bear that in mind, and obviously it should follow on logically from the discussion. We don't want to see new information being introduced at this stage. You wouldn't typically want to refer to sources here unless you're doing it for contextualization. Okay, we wouldn't want to see new information introduced at this stage. We wouldn't want to see a new aspect, a new dimension of the discussion introduced here. All of those different dimensions should have been discussed in the full body of the report, not in the conclusion. The conclusion is only the summary of the main points. Okay, so it's got to follow on logically. We wouldn't want to see new information here. Okay, we should be seeing similar things here. It's also worth saying that it shouldn't be just repeating exactly what's been said word for word in the body of the report. We do want to see it expressed in a fresh way and in a different way. We wouldn't want to see it just copy and pasted from the body of the report. It's got to be summarized. And it's got to be contextualized, okay? So this is typically where you would go back to your research question, the main aim, okay? What you originally set out to do, and communicate, has your work answered this question? We expect to see that answered in the conclusion, okay? So hopefully that gives you some pointers. And then, of course, at the end of the report, after the conclusion, make sure you have a references list where you detail the full details for particular sources that you've read and have cited in your main body of the report. So, there's a whole presentation on this, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but just remember that you need to include the in-text citations within your report. And at the end of the report, you need to list the full details for the source. So if you're not sure how to do that in terms of formatting, go back and have a look at the Harvard referencing presentation. I think it's week 6 in this particular module. Have a look through that, and that should give you the full explanation of how to do this. So to bring this presentation to a close and to wrap up all that we've discussed, here are some questions to ask yourself, some reflective questions for you to be thinking about as you're going through the preparation stages as well as writing the report. Feel free to come back to this slide here and ask these questions during the writing process. So here we go. First question. Have you accurately represented the sources found? Okay, this is typically going to be won or lost in the note-taking stage and how you summarize and condense the source into your notes. Second question, is the source material research current and relevant to the topic? Okay, so hopefully this is something that's been sussed out when you're actually selecting the sources. But again, it's still worth asking this question as you're writing the report. Have you actually found the right sources? Do you need to go back and read some more before you finish up this report? Okay. So let's move down to let's look at the fourth point actually, because I'm assuming we've already answered the third point with selection of the one of the 10 fields of the computing area. But let's look at the fourth point. have you shown the relationships between the sources? Okay, so this is to do with the reports writing, as we've been saying. Make sure that you're linking and showing the relationships between them. Okay, have you done that well? Or are you just regurgitating what the authors are saying and just listing them one after another? That's a no-no. We don't want to do that. Okay, so make sure that you're showing the links between them and that you're only including the relevant themes and ideas expressed by each source so that it is building and developing your narrative, ultimately pointing towards the answer of your research question. Let's move on and have a look at the sixth point here. I'm assuming we've got a clear connection between the topic and the report. But looking at the sixth question, are all of the sources documented accurately? Okay, so this refers to referencing. Make sure that you reference as you go, because otherwise it's going to take a lot of time to go back and hunt for the details. Okay, so that's definitely my advice, is that you record down the details of the reference of the source that you read before you read it or as you read it, but don't leave it too long after you read it, okay, because it's easy to forget where you found that source or that website, and then that takes a long time to find again. Okay, so make sure you document them accurately, and of course make sure you include those references in the references list and make sure that you cite them in the report. Okay, but do be checking that as you go. Okay, next question. This is a good one. Have you got effective transitions from idea to idea? Okay, so this is all about flow. This is all about the finer details of how you write the report. And even for the most experienced writers out there, flow can actually be quite a tricky thing to achieve. So don't worry if that doesn't come from your first draft. It could take multiple drafts for you to be able to get a report that reads nicely and flows easily. Okay, that's going to take time to craft and to sculpt this particular report into something that just flows effortlessly. Okay, so but how you do that, of course, is particularly in how you navigate the transitions from the sections. So does the next section build upon the ideas of the previous? And so on and so on. Do all of the sections build on the ideas of the previous sections? Make sure that you refer back to ideas in previous sections, because that will help to build this narrative for your reader, as we've been saying. Okay, let's move on. Is the analysis of sources well developed? Okay, so this is all going to be about how you analyze the sources that you're reading and taking the notes, and ultimately your interpretation of what's important and what the most important contributions are that you draw out from that. So this is going to show up in your report as you write it. And if you're not happy with what you're seeing as you write it, go back to the source, read it through again, and see if you can draw out something different or something that's more important or more relevant. Okay, and then finally, have you represented all of the conflicts or argumentative sides fairly? And this is really important, because remember, we're all about trying to write a balanced report, okay? Because again, remember what I said earlier, you want to mitigate against the type of questions that a reader is going to be asking. So if you are too one-sided, say you're too positive about a technology, a researcher and a reader reading through that is going to immediately say, well, hang on a minute, what's wrong with this? This sounds way too positive. There's got to be some downsides here. So make sure that you discuss these points fairly. Make sure that you discuss both sides of the argument. Nothing's perfect, so there's going to be downsides to everything. Okay, so make sure that comes through, and make sure that's as balanced as it can be. All right, so we'll finish there. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. Hope that's been helpful. As always, if there are any questions, please do get in touch with myself or Justin, and we'll be happy to help you out.